Hi out there. My name is Haley Mirr. Welcome back to our Land Bulletin series. I'm Haley Mirr. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Development here at Mirr Ranch Group. This is the Land Bulletin, where every other week we discuss the ranch and sporting property market, buying and selling advice, and the latest best stewardship practices, as well as topics currently impacting landowners. Mirr Ranch Group is a full-service ranch real estate brokerage and consulting company focusing on legacy ranches and sporting and conservation properties around the West. Whether it is helping a client acquire or sell a property, one of the many services we provide is helping our clients navigate the nuances of conserving a ranch or purchasing a ranch encumbered with a conservation easement. In today's episode of the Land Bulletin, we look at options that are available to those looking to encumber their ranch or looking to sell to some conservation buyers. Helping us out today is the Senior Project Manager with the Trust for Public Land, Wade Shelton. Welcome, Wade.
Thank you, Ellie.
Awesome.
It's great to be here.
Well, before we get started, Wade, I would love to hear your background and how you kind of came into the Trust for Public Land and what your story is.
Sure. Like a lot of people in Colorado, I'm a transplant and I moved here from the East Coast. And as I joked with a lot of ranchers when I first meet them, it's bad enough that I live in Denver, but you find out I grew up in Baltimore. I might be lucky that you don't kick me out of your house. And I have had a few made the joke of, I've been thinking about it, Wade, and I've learned with time that, you get to know other, ranchers, other people in the community. I have had some folks say, well, so-and-so told me you weren't totally full of it. So we'll see how the talk goes today. But I did grow up in the suburbs of Baltimore, and, I'm not going to pretend I come from, farming or ranching background or the West, but my dad took me hunting, fishing, backpacking, since I was a kid. And I, grew up with a lot of cousins who used to be farmers, and the operative words, they used to be, in the 80s, they, a lot of people got out of the business, had to do other things. I still have one cousin, Martha, who's in her 80s and is still making a go at it as a farmer, but she also works as a dental hygienist for my dad. And I think NRCS conservation programs and conservation easements are largely while she still has a farm. So I knew I wanted to work somehow in environmental field, that kind of thing. And I was fortunate enough while I was in high school to do a wilderness course at the National Outdoor Leadership School, which had me fall in love with the Western United States. And I knew for a long time, that's where I wanted to end up. And, studied environmental biology when I was in college at Colgate University, which I know we're both alums, and we are dancing. We did win the Patriot League, which is very exciting. I really learned a lot about kind of just ecology, but also beyond ecology. The major I had a mix of economics and policy in it as well. And I was fortunate enough to start getting to appreciate on the ground conservation, as opposed to politics. And that I was fortunate to do a study abroad program in Kenya with the School for Field Studies, where I got to live on a working game ranch, which was, really cool. And it really, I think I didn't appreciate it at the time, but looking back on it, it helped me realize how much, working with the folks who own the land, who live in those communities, are really important for, national parks to be successful. Where I worked there, I was working with the Maasai tribe that owned all the land in between Amboseli and Tsavo National Parks in Kenya. And, I was learning firsthand how, private landowners, really can complement public land in a great way and are as essential. You can't have everything, be a national park. And so when I finished college, I was fortunate enough to work for the Nature Conservancy in the West Virginia chapter for a summer, where I absolutely fell in love with private land conservation at that point. I liked that it wasn't political. I liked that it was the kind of thing that it didn't matter, what party you were a member of, what your political beliefs were. They're great conservationists on both sides of the aisle. And great conservationists are totally independent as well. And I was fortunate then to go to graduate school at Duke University's School of the Environment and Earth Sciences, where I really focused on what I would call more of a conservation focus. There was a lot of science, but also policy, economics, and a fair amount of GIS mapping as well. And while I was in school, I interned, for the Nature Conservancy North Carolina chapter for about a year and a half. And the gentleman who ended up becoming my mentor, Hervey McKeever, he's done conservation real estate for the Nature Conservancy for 40 years. And I can still remember when I was finishing up grad school and trying to decide what I was going to do as a career. He, he, he was very kind. He said, Wade, I know you like this GIS stuff and the mapping and the satellite things, but you got personality and you can't teach personality. You need to do deals. And it was not really the best career advice I got. The second piece was when he asked me what I thought about something complicated. And I looked at him and said, Hervey, why are you asking me? I'm not an expert. And he said, compared to most people, you are. Fake it till you make it. That's all anybody does till retirement, really. So really good career advice from him. And that got me on a path where after a stint in outdoor retail that was just out of necessity, I ended up working for one of the oldest land trusts in the country, in the Brandywine Conservancy in southeastern Pennsylvania and Delaware. Then I moved from there to the Eno River Association of North Carolina after a couple of years, where I had the privilege of working to conserve the river I taught myself to fly fish in grad school. And that was really exciting, very personal work, and surprisingly, not a lot of private land conservation was done at Eno. It was more of buying land and adding it to the Eno River State Park, which was great training for a lot of what I do at the Trust for Public Land, on top of the conservation easement experience I got. After that, I met my wife out there, and she had lived in Colorado before, and she was kind enough to humor me, and we tried living in my hometown of Baltimore for a couple of years. Very quickly, we realized we needed to go west and move back to Denver for her, and move there for the first time for me. But I worked for Baltimore County's Department of Environmental Protection and Resource Management. You don't want to say that 5 times fast. Managing waterway restoration projects, in the Chesapeake Bay, and stream restoration projects. And I actually have applied some of what I learned from there to projects in Colorado, which did surprise me later on. But I mostly learned a lot about the challenge of working, for government, the nature of government bureaucracy, and how, most people work for government are great and they want to really do good work, but the nature of who they work for and how they have to do it, they often need partners to kind of bridge that. And it really prepared me well for when my wife Lisa and I moved out here. I interviewed for a job with the Trust for Public Land right away, and finally got to my long-term career goal was I wanted to work for a national conservation group. I wanted to work for one of the bigger private organizations like the Trust for Public Land or the Nature Conservancy that can really help private landowners and government partners do more than they could on their own or working together. And my next goal is retirement. Just don't ask me when.
Love it. Me too. Just kidding. Well, that's an amazing trajectory to hear, working with the Nature Conservancy to local level kind of conservation, to see the difference between the bureaucracy and government agencies, and then finally ending up at TPL. And I would love to know, for those listening, we've had a lot of different types of conservation groups on the podcast, from Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust to people at Wyoming Stock Growers Land Trust to the Nature Conservancy. So I'd love to know, what is the Trust for Public Land and how is it different than some of these other agencies that we might think of when we think of conservation?
Sure. I'm happy to answer that question. I'd say, first and foremost, you mentioned, Cattlemen's and the Nature Conservancy are some of our better partners, in Colorado. And if I worked in Wyoming, I'd say the same thing about the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, that ultimately conservation's matured to the point where, this isn't Teddy Roosevelt, creating national parks or the National Forest Service, on his own. It takes partnerships. And that's really, I think, the key of the Trust for Public Land, compared to a lot of other organizations, in that, we are set up to really protect the connections that people have to land, and make sure that everybody has places to enjoy the outdoors close to home and get outside. And we do that in a lot of ways. Some are more direct. A lot of that is buying land outright, to create new local parks, state parks, regional parks, state wildlife areas, or add to national parks, creating, and that manifests itself in a lot of ways. A lot of people, initially go to thinking, oh, well, you guys help, expand Rocky Mountain National Park, which we do, and which I've been privileged to be a part of. But it can also be something is like a local pocket park. I mean, it was incredible effort by two of my colleagues, Emily Patterson and Antonio Benton, taking a former substation in Denver's Westwood neighborhood and restoring it and turning it into a pocket
Very
park,
cool.
for a neighborhood. We can do things as that small a scale because, at the end of the day, everybody wants to get out and see the iconic, places. But it's also about what can you do when you're close to home? What can you do ideally without having to get in a car and drive or take a bus or public transportation, hopping on your bike or just using your 2 feet. And it's that kind of stuff that grows conservationists. I'm working in this field because of the things my parents did to expose me to the outdoors, not just, on a hunting trip or fishing trip, but just daily things. And what TPL is really about is making sure that everybody has the opportunity to do that. And that we do the kind of work that either creates those direct connections, enhances them, or complements them. So we do that through land protection work where we're buying land outright and getting it ultimately to the right public or nonprofit partner from the local all the way up to the federal level. We also do it by working with private landowners and buying their development rights in the form of conservation easements so that, we can make sure that landscapes like the Upper Arkansas Valley is one of my favorites because I've worked there for nearly 20 years, where 80% of the land's in public ownership. If you really, what's really more critical in the Upper Ark is not necessarily getting more places to get outside, but making sure those places have the wildlife and the views people are expecting to see. And if you're going to really be effective there, that means working with the private ranch owners, on the valley floor who have the land and water rights that are the critical habitat to wildlife species and protect those views and having that balance. So it's not always about, creating new places for people to go outside. We can't, if people could go everywhere, sadly, we'd probably love it all to death, as we saw quite a bit in 2020 when we were all cooped up and everyone was trying to get out to the local open space or crowd national parks so they didn't lose their mind. Similarly, we also do a lot of work with local communities to ultimately make sure that the work we're doing is meeting those community needs. As a national organization, the worst thing we could do would be to come into a community and say, oh, we'll take care of this for you. We know what you need. Don't worry about it. What we need to do is come in and listen. And because most people know is that local park near them, is it safe? Does it have the kind of amenities that local kids and families want to use? If they don't have access to anything, what kind of things are going to change for them? So we have a whole park design and development staff that really works on community-based design and construction to create new urban parks, regional parks, and really make sure that we're taking a bottom-up approach to meet the needs of everybody, and especially listening to the folks who aren't usually heard in those kind of settings. Not necessarily the squeaky wheels, but the folks who might not even realize that park is for them as much as anybody else. And we've done that in Colorado, the local level, in Denver, in Colorado Springs and Panorama Park. We helped lead the community engagement process that remodeled that park into an amazing regional amenity now. And Fisher's Peak State Park, we didn't just lead on the acquisition and partnership with the Nature Conservancy that bought that nearly 20,000 acre property in Trinidad, but we also worked with Colorado Parks and Wildlife on a master planning process to make sure that the park would ultimately meet, the needs of the local community and help them take advantage of having a new state park from an economic standpoint. So really the difference between the Trust for Public Land and a lot of all these other groups is that our job is to be that bridge between the private landowner, the local community, and then the public and nonprofit partners, and sometimes private partners as well, to make sure we have those meaningful places and that we're taking care of them. And that puts us in an interesting spot, and that we don't do anything by ourselves. We're only as good as our partners. So if I'm working in the Upper Arkansas Valley, part of the reason we've been effective is I've worked with land trust partners like Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust and the Central Colorado Conservancy that give us credibility as a national organization we could not have without the connections they have to the local community and the ranching community. It means on big projects like Fisher's Peak State Park, where there is clearly an opportunity to turn a really untrampled property and Fisher's Peak itself into a huge public amenity. But there was also the opportunity to strike a balance between conservation and public recreation from the beginning. More often than not, you're doing one or the other, and then you're realizing, oh, people can't use this wildlife refuge, so they don't see the value in it, or people are loving this park to death, and it's not providing the wildlife habitat to it. And the Trust for Public Land and the Nature Conservancy were really sister organizations, in that TPL literally grew out of the Nature Conservancy in the early 70s, focusing more on people rather than rare habitat,
Right.
rare species. And working together, we could do a lot more at a much larger scale with our two organizations bringing our resources to bear than we could separately. And it made it easier to strike a balance between those things. So, really, I'd say our job with some of the other examples you gave is to expand their capacity, give them resources and expertise that a lot of conservation organizations don't have. I mean, I'd argue we crank out more real estate deals and have more real estate expertise on staff than most conservation organizations out there. And then recognizing, though, that there are other things we can't do and that we can't lean on, and making sure we have the right partners to do it.
And with something like that, like the big Fisher's Peak State Park, how does one get funding for something like that? Because I know that was a giant acquisition. There was a lot of different players involved. How does something like that work?
Well, I'll admit, when I first got the idea, I was literally reading the Sunday New York Times real estate section, like I'm sure a lot of people at Mirr Ranch Group do as well. And there was an article that it could have been titled "Ranches Most of You Can't Afford." They had a more creative name for it, but it was basically listing, some of the bigger ranches for sale around the country. And I stumbled upon what was then called the Crazy French Ranch. And, okay, it includes Fisher's Peak, which is the actual, backdrop to the city of Trinidad and its logo. Nearly 20,000 acres right off I-25. And I looked at it and I thought, I don't know how we're going to do it, but I got to go look at that property. I mean, that could be a state park or state wildlife area. That could be huge. And I was fortunate to be able to hike up to the top of Fisher's Peak. Probably should have used some ropes and harnesses.
Your wife probably would have liked that too.
Yeah, she when I told her what we did, she was not happy with what I had done in the moment. And it was just clearly an amazing opportunity. But and I actually immediately called my counterpart at the Nature Conservancy, because I know southeastern Colorado was an area they had done a lot of work traditionally, and they've probably thought about this too. And this is big enough. This could be something maybe we could work together on. And my counterpart, TNC Matt Moorhead, and I both immediately said, "Yeah, we got to figure this out." But we had to wait around for about 3-4 years before the rest of the world caught up to what we saw. And really, a lot of what we do at TPL with those kind of projects is giving our public partners and funders and the landowner confidence that we can do something that when you start, a lot of people are saying, you can't do that. That's too big, that's too expensive. How are you going to do it? And for us, a lot of it first was waiting for the seller to realize that working with us was going to be just as lucrative as working with the developer. And they hadn't had any, developers or private buyers that were willing to pay their asking price, and realizing that we were, as long as we could justify it with an appraisal, and that working with us was going to make sure a property that they loved, where their husband had passed away, where their husband was buried, was not going to get turned into a sea of houses. They weren't going to get paid but lose their soul, so to speak, in the process. And I mean, that's the theme of why a lot of landowners work with us. So first was the landowner being willing to recognize that we were a good option for them. The second was really the city of Trinidad coming around and recognizing that this was an opportunity for them, that perhaps they could own a piece of this. And that gave the most essential piece for the Trust for Public Land and the Nature Conservancy was a public partner that was willing to own it. We knew we'd need to raise all the money and set up the right kind of management partnership between them and Colorado Parks and Wildlife, because it's no secret. The city of Trinidad and most municipalities do not have the resources to manage nearly 20,000 acres. But them being willing to own it broke down a huge barrier of, okay, well, who's going to take care of this property long term? Neither of our organizations were set up to own it forever. And then it was a matter of, really whittling away at the purchase price, at getting Great Outdoors Colorado Trust Fund to see the opportunity we did, and get them willing to give us a grant that did not get us, even halfway to the purchase price, but was still really significant. Getting Colorado Parks and Wildlife to do the same thing, of working with their land managers at the local level who really knew the property as well and could explain to their bosses and their leadership of, this is really an amazing property, we should go after it. And then also working with that local community to show that politically there was a path to do this, that citizens in Trinidad had been looking at Fisher's Peak for 30 years and not being able to access it or use it. People saying, I went hunting there with my grandfather, but I can't take my kids there because it's private. And realizing that we could potentially give that back to them. And that's what ultimately got us enough money where the Trust for Public Land and Nature Conservants were willing to use our own internal resources to finance the purchase and buy and hold it, betting on ourselves that with enough time, we'll be able to raise the money we need from public and private sources to convey it into public ownership. And what really then changed is us showing that it was possible and then actually buying and holding the property. That's what made it real for so many people. And that's what got Governor Polis in the summer of 2019 to see what we did and say, I know you were planning on selling this to Trinidad and making it a regional park, but I'm going to figure out, with my agencies of how we're going to bridge your fundraising gap, and we're going to make it into a state park, and we're going to close by April, 2020. So it was really, I joke, it was TPL and TNC kicking the proverbial door open to show there is a path to do this, but we're going to have to take some risk, and we need, some pledges and some investment from public partners to get there. That ultimately got others to see what we did, and in the end, make it more than we had initially envisioned, because we kept kind of an open mind and kept talking to people across the board about why something like that was important. So it takes patience, and quite honestly,
it's amazing. I mean, we've worked with TPL in the past. We've worked, when you were talking about, conservation buyers with TNC down south, we did JE Canyon with the Nature Conservancy, which was super fun to work on. But it does give insight, to your point, when landowners are wondering, what am I going to do with this property when I sell it? I don't, like you said, it has this meaningful piece with, my husband being buried on the property, things like that. Everyone has their different reason why they love the land. But to be able to find conservation buyers like TPL to make those a reality is pretty incredible. And I don't think a lot of our, landowners or sellers know that some of those opportunities do exist, that there are people with that type of capital that can conserve properties the way that, you envisioned it for stewardship and years to come for your family. So it's neat to see how you guys worked with all these different agencies to make that happen. And if those listening don't know what that is, if you just Google it quickly, you'll get a lot of different articles about it. It's a really incredible project. And like Wade was saying, a joint effort from a lot of different people. So very, very cool that you guys worked on that.